There are men who embody evil with such mechanical efficiency, so devoid of visible passion, that they are more terrifying than the fanatics who shout from the balconies. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich was one of those men. Born on March 7, 1904 in Halle an der Saale, a provincial city in Prussian Saxony, this son of a music conservatory director and opera violinist would build in less than a decade the most efficient repressive apparatus that the modern world had seen until then. He did not do it with speeches. He did so with folders, files, denunciations, and lists. Head of the Reich Security Central Office, RSA, commander of the Gestapo, organizer of the Einsatzgruppen, president of the infamous Wannsee Conference, acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Each of these titles represents by itself hundreds of thousands of deaths. Together they represent the backbone of the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler himself, who did not pay praise easily, publicly called him the man with the heart of iron. Heinrich Himmler, his formal superior, feared him with a mixture of admiration and dread that was difficult to conceal. Within the SS, veteran generals spoke of him in hushed tones. But Heydrich's story does not begin in the chambers of horror. It starts with humiliation. A young naval officer, brilliant but deeply insecure, expelled from the Kriegsmarine in disgrace, unable to marry the one he promised. A man who carried the weight of rumors. He was said to have Jewish blood, a rumor that haunted him all his life, and that paradoxically may have fueled the ferocity with which he persecuted the Jews. That wound never healed, and it was precisely from that wound that he built everything else. What follows is not just the story of a war criminal. It is the story of how a system can turn wounded mediocrity into systematized horror. And it is also the story of the two men, a Slovak and a Czech, who decided that this horror had to end, even if it cost them their lives. Because someone had to. The city of Halle an der Saale, about 30 kilometers northwest of Leipzig, was not a particularly aggressive place at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a city of music, of universities, of a cultured bourgeoisie that prided itself on its conservatories. Bruno Heydrich, Reinhard's father, had founded the Halle Conservatory of Music, Theatre and Pedagogy there in 1901, and had a certain reputation as a Wagnerian tenor. In 1895, 9 years before his son was born, Bruno had even composed an opera whose protagonist bore a name that would turn out to be in time eerily prophetic, The Crime of Reinhard. Little Reinhard grew up in that environment of culture and discipline between scores and rehearsals under the stern gaze of his mother Elizabeth, whose domestic rigidity complemented his father's artistic temperament. From childhood he showed a talent for the violin, a talent that he kept throughout his life and that he would use in his years of power to perform chamber quartets with musicians invited to his villa. The same man who signed mass deportation orders played Beethoven with precise fingers and an almost monastic concentration. But Reinhard's childhood was also marked by something he could never control: rumors. From school, his classmates called him Isi, an abbreviation of Isidor, a name then associated with Jews in German anti-Semitic circles. Later, when his voice changed to that strange, high-pitched, almost feminine timbre that would accompany him for the rest of his life, the taunts intensified. Added to his figure-tall, thin, wide hips that some thought effeminate and the lies about his ancestry, Heydrich was a natural target for bullying at the time. Historians have debated at length whether there was any real basis in the rumors about his Jewish ancestry. Investigations of the Nazi regime itself, carried out when Heydrich was already a figure of power, found no evidence. But the accusation was humiliating enough that he himself investigated it with an almost obsessive paranoia. According to historian Robert Gerwarth, author of what is probably the most comprehensive biography of Heydrich published in English, this constitutive insecurity was one of the psychological engines of his career. The question that some ask quietly, did he persecute the Jews to prove that he was not one of them, has no definitive answer, but it is not far-fetched either. In the spring of 1922, after earning his high school diploma, Heydrich made a decision that surprised his father. Instead of pursuing a musical career, he enlisted in the Reichsmarine, the German Navy, on March 30th of that year. He was 18 years old. The Navy was then an intensely nationalistic institution, proud of itself despite, or perhaps because of, the humiliation that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles had brought to German naval power. For a young man like Heydrich, who since childhood had followed with devotion the war chronicles of the Great War, and who dreamed of a more solid identity than the one offered by his father's conservatory, the Navy had the attraction of a fraternity where he could show who he really was. It wasn't that simple. Adapting to the officer corps environment was difficult. Heydrich was smart, diligent, and physically capable. He was a high-level swordsman, a competent horseman, and later a pilot. But the same combination of defensive arrogance and heightened sensitivity that had caused him problems at school continued to complicate their relationships. An officer who served with him during this period described him as capable of a calculated toughness in professional relationships and an almost childlike vulnerability when he felt personally attacked. It was in the Navy that he served for a time under the indirect orders of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the same man who years later would head the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, and who would become one of the few actors in the regime who had the courage, belated and ambiguous, to resist it from within. By 1928, Heydrich had reached the rank of lieutenant. In December 1930, at a ball in Kiel, he met Lina von Osten, the daughter of a schoolteacher from the Baltic island of Fehmarn. Lina was blonde, young, 19 years old, with deep-rooted National Socialist convictions that she herself did not hide. The courtship was accelerated. After just 4 meetings, they got engaged. It was, at least in part, a calculated decision. Lina embodied the Aryan image that Heydrich needed to project in order to silence the rumors once and for all. But then came the scandal that would change everything. The exact versions of what happened vary depending on the source, but the core of the matter is clear. Heydrich had been in a relationship with the daughter of a senior manager at the Kiel shipyards, a relationship that implied, according to the social understanding of the time, a promise of marriage. When he broke that bond to get engaged to Lina von Osten, the young woman's father, feeling offended in his family's honor, filed a formal complaint with the Navy leadership. In May 1931, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder ordered that a naval court of honor be convened to examine Heydrich's conduct. What happened in that room is, in itself, revealing of the man's character. According to the records of the trial, his behavior in court bordered on arrogance. He lied shamelessly, denied the obvious, and showed such a manifest contempt for the dignity of the process that the judges themselves were scandalized. The court found him guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and forced him to surrender his commission in April 1931. The expulsion came when he was just a few weeks away from gathering the years of service necessary to collect a pension. That detail matters. It wasn't just dishonor, it was economic ruin. And it came at the worst possible time. Germany in 1931 was at the bottom of the Great Depression. Unemployment exceeded 30% of the active population. Banks failed. The streets of Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig were full of veterans, of unemployed professionals, of young people with no visible future. Heydrich was 27 years old, with a tainted record and no obvious civilian qualifications. Even the modest salary he had received in the Navy, and which he hoped to become a pension, had disappeared. It was precisely Lina, his future wife, who directed him towards the party that was transforming Germany, the NSDAP, Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party. Lina von Osten was a convinced anti-Semite long before she met Reinhard. His brother was already a member of the party's ranks. She pointed the way to him, and a friend of the Heydrich family, Karl von Eberstein, managed to arrange a meeting that would change everything, a meeting with Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. There is an underground irony in that encounter that historians frequently point out. Himmler was looking for someone with a background in naval intelligence to build an internal spy service within the SS. It was believed that Heydrich, because of his time in the Navy, had that experience. But as historian Mark M. Boatner III pointed out decades later, Heydrich had served in communications, not intelligence proper. Himmler made the decision based on incomplete information. It didn't matter. The result was the same. The story of that meeting, documented by several biographers and referred to in the regime's own archives, has something of a fable about it. When Heydrich entered Himmler's Munich office in June 1931, the latter subjected him to a simple test. He handed him a blank piece of paper and asked him to sketch the organizational chart of an intelligence service in 30 minutes. Heydrich had no real experience in the sector, but he had read spy novels and he had an organizational mind of the first order. Within half an hour, he drew a scheme that impressed Himmler enough to hire him on the spot. The starting salary was only 180 Reichsmarks a month, less than what he earned in the Navy. Heydrich accepted it without hesitation. On August 1, 1931, Reinhard Heydrich assumed command of the newly created SD Sicherheitsdienst, the SS security service. Their initial resources were pathetic: a small shared office in the Brown House, NSDAP headquarters in Munich, a borrowed typewriter, scissors, glue, and a few unemployed men willing to do informant work. According to historian Andrew Mollo, in those early weeks, Heydrich literally operated from a kitchen table, cutting out press clippings and gluing index cards by hand. On December 26th of that same year, he married Lena von Osten. And so began Reinhard Heydrich's second life. But there is a detail that turns that foundational stage into something more than a story of resurrected personal ambition. The rumors about his Jewish ancestry did not disappear with his entry into the SS. On the contrary, they intensified. In 1932, figures such as Wilhelm Canaris, his former boss in the Navy, and Gauleiter Rudolf Jordan spread these insinuations within the party itself. The matter reached the NSDAP's racial expert, Dr. Achim Gerke, who investigated Heydrich's genealogy with the same rigor with which the regime investigated others. His report was categorical. Heydrich was of German origin and free of any trace of Jewish blood. The file was formally closed, but the rumors never quite died, and Heydrich knew it. That knowledge, buried but never extinguished, was perhaps the most constant fuel of his entire career. Heydrich's rise within the Nazi power apparatus was not simply the product of personal ambition, although ambition also played a role. It was, above all, the result of an intuitive understanding of something that most of his contemporaries took years to understand. In a totalitarian regime, information is the most enduring form of power. From his small office in Munich, Heydrich began building what would become the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus Europe had ever known. He systematically recruited young university students, not the types of street brutes that proliferated in the ranks of the SA, Ernst Röhm's stormtroopers, but men with doctorates, with legal training, with analytical skills. According to historian Michael Wild, who studied extensively the composition of the RSHA's leadership team, most of the middle leaders Heydrich recruited in those early years were college graduates under the age of 40, many with doctoral degrees. It was, in contemporary terminology, a horror startup. The files he began to accumulate on party members, politicians, businessmen, aristocrats, and generals quickly became his real source of influence. These files contained compromising political commitments, extramarital affairs, debts, secrets. There is no documentation that he systematically used them as blackmail in the early years, but the implicit threat was sufficient. Everyone knew that Heydrich had a dossier on practically everyone. It was said that he had one about Hitler himself. By the time the party took power in January 1933, Heydrich was already an indispensable part of the apparatus. In March of that year, he took control of the political police in Munich and Bavaria. Throughout 1934, he extended this control to the rest of the Reich, until he also took command of the Gestapo in Prussia. By 1936, when Himmler was appointed head of all German police forces, Heydrich was already his second most powerful, with unified command of the SD, the Kripo, and the Gestapo. He was SS-Obergruppenführer und General der Polizei, the equivalent of a four-star general, and he was 32 years old. That same year, something happened that says a lot about man. Heydrich flew fighter aircraft in the Norwegian and French campaigns, and then in the Soviet Union. It wasn't an eccentricity, it was a deliberate demonstration that he wasn't a desk bureaucrat, that he had guts. On July 22, 1941, just a month into the Soviet invasion, his plane was shot down by anti-aircraft fire behind enemy lines. He managed to evade a Soviet patrol and rejoin the German lines. Hitler, upon learning of it, personally ordered him to stop flying. He could not risk the man who knew the most secrets of the Reich being taken prisoner by the Soviets. There were two things that made Heydrich truly different from almost all other Nazi leaders. The first was his coldness. Most of the party's leaders, Goering, Himmler, even Hitler at certain times, operated from emotion, from visceral hatred, from theatricality. Heydrich did not. Those who knew him described that coldness with very similar words: calculating, distant, able to look someone in the eye while deciding his fate without moving a muscle in his face. Walter Schellenberg, head of foreign intelligence for the RSHA and one of Heydrich's closest men, would write after the war, "Behind that perfectly controlled outer facade lived a demon-driven man who could barely keep at bay." The second difference was that he was not an ideological fanatic in the sense that Himmler or Streicher were. Heydrich's anti-Semitism was, to a large extent, functional. He was not moved by racial hatred in the visceral sense. He was driven by the efficiency of the systems, the power of the mechanisms. The Jews were, in their cold logic, a problem to be solved, and he was the man who solved problems. On the night of November 9th, 1938, Germany was rocked by what the regime euphemistically called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. In reality, it was a pogrom organized from Berlin, executed under the cover of a spontaneous reaction of the German people to the assassination in Paris of the Nazi diplomat Ernst vom Rath at the hands of a young Polish Jew named Herschel Greenspan. Greenspan was a 17-year-old teenager who had just learned that his family had been expelled from Germany. His parents had been deported to the Polish border, along with thousands of Jews of Polish origin, in an operation organized weeks earlier. When he shot vom Rath at the German embassy in Paris on November 7th, he had no idea that his act would be the pretext the regime was waiting for or fabricating to take the next step. Heydrich was one of the main organizers of what came next. At 1:20 a.m. on November 10th from Berlin, he sent an urgent teletype to all the state police and SD headquarters in Germany and Austria. The document, preserved in the archives of the Nuremberg trial under the reference PS 3051, is a disturbing example of how terror can be organized in administrative language. His instructions were precise on multiple levels. The fire could only be ignited where there was no risk of spreading to non-Jewish German property. Jewish businesses and homes could be destroyed but not looted. Theft was criminalized, not out of compassion, but because it tarnished the image of spontaneity that the regime needed to project. Foreign citizens, even if they were Jewish, were not to be touched, to avoid diplomatic incidents. And then the central, cold and specific instruction. In all districts, as many Jewish men were to be arrested as could be housed in the available prisons. Preferably young and healthy, not too old. There was no crime that justified arrest. The criterion was exclusively racial and physical ability. After arrest, detainees were to be immediately transferred to the nearest concentration camps: Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. There was another detail in the telegram that speaks of Heydrich's logic with a clarity that no historian has been able to ignore. Synagogues could burn, yes, but before they were burned, the files had to be confiscated and handed over to the SD. Historical material, community documents, genealogical records. It was not vandalism. It was an intelligence operation disguised as a popular riot. During that night and the next morning, more than 1,400 synagogues were set on fire throughout Germany and Austria. About 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were looted and destroyed. The streets of German cities woke up covered in broken glass, hence the name. Estimates of direct deaths during the pogrom vary between 91 and 400, but that figure does not include subsequent deaths in the camps. In Dachau and Buchenwald alone, at least 383 of the detainees died in the following months from ill treatment, disease, and summary executions. By November 16th, when Heydrich issued the order to halt the arrests, more than 30,000 Jewish men had been deported to the three camps. It was, according to the USHMM's own historians, the first time in the history of the regime that people were massively arrested solely because they were Jewish without any other legal pretext. All previous mechanisms, the Nuremberg Law, labor restrictions, the forced Aryanization of business, had maintained the appearance of a legal framework. With Kristallnacht, that appearance disappeared. The regime no longer needed a pretext. And it was Heydrich who gave the instructions to make it so. But before he got to that point, Heydrich had already shown what he was capable of in an event that historians consider his first great leap on the scale of real power. The Night of the Long Knives, on June 30th, 1934. To understand this episode, one must understand the tension that existed in 1934 between the SS and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, Ernst Röhm's brown shirts. The SA had been the violent arm of the party during its rise to power. 3 million men, many of them veterans of the Great War, brutal and difficult to control. Röhm, his chief of staff and an old personal friend of Hitler, dreamed of integrating the SA into a new People's Revolutionary Army to supplant the Wehrmacht. The generals of the Reichswehr, which Hitler needed, rejected him with horror, and Hitler himself was beginning to see in Röhm a threat to his absolute authority. It was Heydrich who built the dossier. Acting in conjunction with Himmler and Göring, he compiled a folder on Röhm that included actual information about his homosexuality, a lever he knew would work against someone as viscerally homophobic as Hitler, and fabricated evidence, an alleged deal in which Röhm accepted 12 million marks from France in exchange for conspiring against Hitler. The evidence was a fabrication, but it came at the right time, to the right recipient, in the right format. That was enough. In the early morning of June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, Operation Kolibri, that was the code name, executed the purge. The SS and Gestapo, under Heydrich's direct coordination, arrested and executed SA leadership throughout Germany. Röhm was arrested at his hotel in Bad Wiessee, Bavaria, and finally shot in his cell on July 1st. The official number of executed was more than 150, although later estimates put the figure at more than double. Among the victims were not only SA leaders, also former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, conservative critic Edgar Jung, and former Bavarian leader Gustav von Kahr, who had betrayed Hitler during the Munich Putsch of 1923 and had been waiting for that bill for 11 years. The Night of the Long Knives had concrete and immediate consequences for Heydrich's power. The SA was emasculated as a political force. The SS, independent of the SA, became the undisputed elite of the repressive apparatus of the Reich, and Himmler, with Heydrich at his side, consolidated unified control over the entire German police, a process that would culminate in 1936 when Himmler was appointed head of all the Reich's police forces and Heydrich was left in charge of the unified security police. Kristallnacht was also a moment of revelation for the outside world. Several powers formally protested. The New York Times published detailed stories on the front page. US Ambassador Hugh Wilson was recalled to Washington as a sign of protest, but in Germany the regime interpreted these reactions as enemy propaganda and acts of terror increased. For Heydrich, Kristallnacht was above all an organizational success. He demonstrated that his apparatus could mobilize nationally coordinated violence in a matter of hours and do so in a way that could be presented as spontaneous. That ability to orchestrate chaos while maintaining control was what made him the indispensable man Hitler would need for the task that would come later, the final solution. Before gas chambers existed, before trains began rolling into Auschwitz with their human cargo, there was another method, more direct, more primitive, and exponentially more visible. When German forces invaded Poland in September 1939, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile action groups of the security police and the SD, began operating behind the front lines with a clear mission: to eliminate the enemies of the Reich in the occupied territories. That included Jews, Polish intellectuals, clergy, state officials. The methods were primitive: mass shootings in previously dug pits, in open fields, on the margins of forests. But it was with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, that the Einsatzgruppen reached a scale of horror that human language can barely contain. Heydrich organized 4 groups, called A, B, C, and D, that operated in different sectors of the Eastern Front. His instructions, drawn from the archives of the Nuremberg trial, left no doubt about the goal: Soviet Jews were to be eliminated. At Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, on September 29 and 30, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C murdered 33,771 Jews in 48 hours. The method was always the same. The victims were led to the edge of the ravine, ordered to strip naked, and shot. The bodies fell to the bottom. The survivors of adjacent shootings were buried alive. The noise of the gunshot was constant for 2 days. The inhabitants of Kiev, several kilometers away, could hear him. It was during that same week that Hermann Göring, in his capacity as second-in-command of the regime, signed the formal commission to Heydrich, authorizing him to take all necessary organizational, material, and financial measures for the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question throughout Europe. The date on that document is July 31, 1941. Heydrich was 37 years old and had just received the most extensive mandate of extermination that any official had ever had in modern history. The villa in Am Großen Wannsee, number 56, 58 on the southwestern outskirts of Berlin, was an elegant residence overlooking Lake Wannsee. It had been purchased in 1940 by the SD from businessman Friedrich Minuth for a transaction price that some documents suggest was significantly lower than market value, one of the many acquisitions of the regime that combined formal legality with implicit coercion. The building was used as a conference center and lodging for the SS leadership. Heydrich had attempted to convene such a conference in December 1941, initially set for the 9th of that month. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th and Hitler's subsequent declaration of war on the United States, a decision that baffled much of the German General Staff, forced it to be postponed. On January 8, 1942, Heydrich sent out new invitations for January 20th. 15 senior officials of the Nazi Party and the German state would attend. Half were under 40 years old. 8 were lawyers by training. 10 had completed university studies, of which 8 had a doctorate degree. It was, in academic terms, one of the most qualified groups the Reich could muster, and they sat around a table to plan the largest mass murder in history. Among them, Adolf Eichmann, head of the RSHA's Jewish Affairs Office and an expert on forced emigration since 1938, who also acted as secretary of the meeting, taking shorthand notes. Eichmann had arrived at that meeting with a previous job already done: a carefully drawn-up list of the estimated number of Jews in each country in Europe, divided into 2 columns. The first included the territories under direct German control. The second, the countries that are allied, neutral, or at war with Germany. The total sum was 11,200,000 people. It was the figure that Heydrich would present as the scope of the plan. The meeting began around noon. Heydrich's presentation was long, systematic, and deliberately euphemistic in language: evacuation to the east, special treatment, final treatment, but perfectly intelligible to all present. Several of the attendees had already known for months what was happening in the eastern territories. The Einsatzgruppen had been operating since June 1941, and the first extermination camps, Chelmno, had begun operations in December 1941, were already in operation. What Wannsee was coordinating was not the initiative to kill, but the industrialization of that process on a continental scale, and the clear distribution of responsibilities among all the Reich agencies that would need to collaborate. Heydrich laid out the plan in stages. Jews fit for work would be employed in road construction in the eastern regions, in large columns of work separated by sex. Those who did not survive that process, or those who were left in the end, would receive special treatment. No one in the room asked what exactly that expression meant. Everyone knew it. What Heydrich achieved at Wannsee was not simply coordinating a policy that was already underway. What he achieved was something more sophisticated and, to a certain extent, more perverse. He engaged everyone present. Representatives of the civilian ministries, men who in some cases had expressed prior objections to mass deportations, were made formal accomplices by signing off at that meeting. The specific nature of what was discussed was documented in the protocol that everyone would receive. There were no neutral observers around that table, only participants. Historian David Cesarani, Eichmann's biographer, points out that Heydrich's main goal at Wannsee was not so much to convey new information to attendees, many already had it, but to assert his own authority as the supreme coordinator of the final solution, over and above the civilian ministries and military commanders who had at times resisted the deportations bureaucratically. Heydrich wanted no one in Berlin to be able to say afterwards that he did not know, and he wanted no one to be able to obstruct the process without being exposed as resistant to a policy that had been formally approved and recorded in the minutes. At the end of the formal meeting, which lasted approximately 90 minutes, Heydrich, the head of the Gestapo Heinrich Müller, and Eichmann were left alone in the room. According to Eichmann's own testimony during his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, the three smoked and drank cognac by the fireplace for a while. It was, Eichmann recalled, unusual to see Heydrich drinking. He was usually a teetotaler, but that afternoon he was satisfied. Eichmann described that moment as one of the few when he saw Heydrich relaxed, without the controlled tension that it usually projected, almost happy. The system was built. All that remained was to make it work. The Wannsee Protocol, 15 pages, was distributed in 30 copies to the various participating firms. Eichmann drafted them based on his stenographic notes, and Heydrich personally revised them before authorizing them, eliminating what he described as vulgarisms and adjusting the tone to more official language. 30 copies marked Secret Reich Affair. By the end of the war, almost all of them were destroyed. In 1947, German-American lawyer Robert Kempner, expelled from Germany by the Nazis because of his Jewish origins and who returned as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, found copy number 16 among the files confiscated from the German Foreign Office. That copy, only one of 30, is today the most important historical document we have on the bureaucratic planning of the Holocaust. It is worth dwelling on that figure. One of 30. The other 29 were burned, buried, methodically destroyed by men who knew exactly what they contained. If that single copy had not survived, the argument of ignorance, the one that so many Nazi officials wielded in the post-war trials, would have proved incomparably more difficult to refute. In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the conference, the village of Wannsee was made a permanent memorial. Historian Joseph Wolf, an Auschwitz survivor who had fought for decades to make it happen, did not live to see it. He had committed suicide in 1974. In one of his last letters, he wrote that he felt that the world had forgotten too quickly and that he no longer had the strength to keep reminding her. The memorial he proposed in 1965 took 27 years to materialize. In September 1941, Hitler made a decision that surprised many in the upper echelons of the regime. The Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech territory occupied since 1939, Konstantin von Neurath, was temporarily relieved of his duties. Von Neurath was considered too conciliatory. Czech industrial production, central to the German war effort, was threatened by resistance and sabotage. And in Berlin, the dominant view was that the situation called for a tougher hand. The hand of choice was Heydrich's. On the 27th of September 1941, Reinhard Heydrich was appointed Stellvertretender Reichsprotektor, acting Reich Protector, of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. His arrival in Prague was announced with a fanfare of intimidation. In its first weeks, the special tribunals of the Protectorate sentenced 342 people to death, and handed over to the Gestapo 1,289 more, as Heydrich himself recorded in a report sent to Berlin in November 1941, a copy of which we have in the Nuremberg archives. The executions were published in newspapers and posted on posters in public buildings, names, dates, positions. It was pedagogical terror. For the Czechs, Heydrich's arrival was an experience of systemic shock. Prague was, in 1941, a city that had learned to survive under occupation with a mixture of passive resistance and strategic collaboration. That is over. The arrests of trade union leaders, intellectuals, priests and officials suspected of sympathizing with the Czech government in exile, which operated from London under the presidency of Edvard Beneš, multiplied. The premier of the collaborationist government, Alois Elias, was arrested on the same day as Heydrich's arrival, tried and sentenced to death. But Heydrich was not just horror. He was also a clever carrot manager when he considered it tactically useful. For the Czech industrial workers, those who operated the armaments factories in Skoda, Brno, Ostrava, which were essential to German war production, he established a system of improved food rations, medical care, paid holidays. The objective was clear: to maximize productivity. The production of the Czech factories under his command increased considerably in just months. That same efficiency that he applied to extermination, he applied to industrial management. He was, in that horrendous sense, a brilliant administrator. His family moved to live with him in Jungfernbräschen Castle, Panenska Brezany in Czech, about 16 kilometers north of Prague. It was property confiscated from Max Hohenlohe, a Jewish businessman. There, Heydrich began his days playing the violin in the mornings, playing with his three sons, Klaus, born in 1933, Heider in 1934, and Silke in 1939, while his wife Lena was expecting their fourth child. That image of domestic normality coexisted, without apparent inner contradiction, with the orders she signed every afternoon. The city of Prague would give the world the title with which history would remember it: the Butcher of Prague. In the nomenclature of Nazi horror, that nickname had competition, but few won it with such efficiency and in such a short time. While Heydrich was consolidating his rule over Bohemia and Moravia from Panensky Brezany Castle, some 2,000 kilometers away in the cold and foggy lands of northern Scotland, two men practiced parachute jumps and disarmed weapons blindfolded. Josef Gabčík was born on April 8, 1912, in Polovci, a small village in northwestern Slovakia, then part of Czechoslovakia. The son of peasant families, he had completed military service in the Czechoslovak army and was a non-commissioned officer when the German invasion disintegrated the country in March 1939. In the face of the occupation, Gabčík did what a remarkable number of Czech and Slovak soldiers did. He crossed clandestinely into Poland, and from there he joined the French Foreign Legion. It was the only available way to continue fighting. Jan Kubis was Czech, born on the 24th of June 1913 in Dolny Vilemovich in Moravia to a working family. He had also served in the Czechoslovak army, had also escaped to Poland, and had also ended up in France under the flags of the Legion. It was in this context probably that Gabčík and Kubis met. They shared not only the origin but also that particular character of men who have seen their homeland fall and have chosen to continue fighting, a determination that has not much of romantic heroism and that is more like a debt that does not admit of prescription. After the fall of France in June 1940, Czech and Slovak forces were evacuated to Britain, where the Czechoslovak government in exile under the presidency of Edvard Beneš continued to operate in London. By the autumn of 1941, Beneš and the Czech Military Intelligence Service, headed by General František Moravec, were under increasing pressure. The Allies questioned the legitimacy of the government in exile. The Germans claimed that the Czechs had meekly accepted the occupation, and the Munich Agreement of 1938, which had handed over the Sudetenland to Hitler with the approval of France and England, still poisoned the relationship between Beneš and his Western allies. The solution that Moravec, in coordination with the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, proposed was brutal in its logic: assassinate Heydrich. A spectacular blow in the heart of the Reich would prove that the Czech resistance was real. It would force the Allies to take a stand. And if it went well, it would eliminate the man who was, operationally, the most dangerous brain in the Nazi apparatus. The operation was codenamed Anthropoid. In Greek, it means inhuman form. It is the term that zoologists use to describe primates that morphologically resemble man. On October 28, 1941, Czechoslovakia's Independence Day, a deliberate and symbolic election, formal preparation began. From among the 2,000 Czechoslovak soldiers exiled in Britain, General Moravec personally selected 24 of the fittest. They were sent to Arisaig, Scotland, to one of the SOE's training centres, where they were subjected to an intensive regimen of hand-to-hand combat, explosive handling, survival techniques, clandestine communications, and parachute jumps. Gabčík and Kubis were selected to execute the main mission. But before we got to that point, there was a setback. Gabčík's original partner in the mission, Sergeant Karel Svoboda, suffered a serious head injury during training exercises. Gabčík insisted that his replacement be Kubis. He knew their character, trusted their reflexes, and knew that in such an operation, the personal chemistry between the executors was as important as technical skills. The command accepted. The night of December 28, 1941, was not suitable for flying. The weather over Central Europe was inclement: snow, wind, low clouds that made visual navigation almost impossible. A Halifax bomber from 138 Squadron RAF took off from RAF Tangmere Air Base in southern England, with 9 paratroopers on board, distributed in 3 different mission groups, with Gabčík and Kubis forming the Anthropoid group. The plan was to release them to the east of Pilsen, where they had established contacts with the resistance network. What happened was different. The crew of the Halifax had serious navigational problems, snow-blinded landmarks on land, and the 2 groups landed in completely different locations than planned. Gabčík and Kubis fell near Nevízdy, east of Prague, more than 60 kilometers from the planned site. The arrival was chaotic from the first second. Gabčík, approaching the ground in the dark, misjudged the height and landed violently, hurting his left foot. Kubis landed without serious injuries. The 2 men moved in the dark, buried their parachutes in the snow, and sought refuge in the abandoned tunnels of an old stone quarry on the outskirts of town. It was midnight. It was several degrees below zero. During the night, a local game warden, whose name has not made it into historical records with certainty, heard the noise of the plane, climbed to the roof of his house, and made out 2 bundles falling into the field. The next morning, he found the parachutes buried and followed a trail of footprints in the snow. He reached the 2 men inside the quarry and confronted them. Gabčík and Kubis first tried the alibi of being surveyors. It didn't work. His identity documents were perfect on paper, but absolutely incongruous with the behavior of someone who has just spent the night in a frozen quarry. In the face of the inevitable, they revealed the truth. The guard, after a few moments that must have seemed eternal to the 2 soldiers, chose to help them. They weren't the only ones who had heard them arrive. That same morning, a second man appeared, a miller from the area who had also heard the plane and who turned out to be a member of Sokol, a Czech nationalist organization banned by the Nazis. It was precisely the kind of contact that their instructions forbade them to establish before completing the mission. But they were 60 kilometers from where they should be. One of them was walking in pain, and they did not have the previous contacts necessary to move safely. They violated the rules. They accepted the help. In the following months, Gabčík and Kubis moved around Prague under the protection of a network of ordinary families. A married couple of engineers, a family of civil servants, a woman who worked in the administration of the Protectorate. Each of these people knew that if they were discovered, they would be executed. And I also knew that they would probably kill their families. They did it anyway. During the months they were in Prague before the bombing, from January to May 1942, Gabčík and Kubis watched Heydrich with the patience and methodicity of men who know they will only get one chance. They studied their routes, their schedules, their habits. They even received information from people who worked inside the castle of Panenska Brezhany. What they discovered gave them at the same time hope and despair. Heydrich was enormously vulnerable in one particular respect. Unlike most of the Reich's top hierarchs, he refused to travel with an armed escort. He did not have a personal security guard. He traveled the 16-kilometer journey between his castle and his office in Prague's Czernin Palace, where he had his headquarters in a Mercedes-Benz 320 cabriolet convertible, accompanied only by his chauffeur, SS-Obergruppenführer Johannes Klein. Unshielded, no convoy, no armed men on the sides. The reason for this deliberate lack of protection was, according to those who knew him, a mixture of arrogance and a demonstration of psychological strength. Heydrich wanted the Czechs to know that he was not afraid of them. He wanted them to understand that the terror he represented made any personal protection unnecessary. It was, in the terms of its own logic of domination, the clearest example of who was in charge. That arrogance would be what would kill him. The two paratroopers analyzed several possible locations for the attack. The castle was too guarded. The route passed through several stretches of open road where an ambush would have been risky. But there was one spot on the route that was particularly favorable, a sharp curve in the Holsovikach neighborhood on the outskirts of Prague, where traffic forced vehicles to slow down. It was the point where Heydrich's Mercedes would be most vulnerable. They also received information that Heydrich might soon be transferred to other responsibilities. Rumors circulated that Hitler would need him elsewhere. The pressure to act before that transfer took place became unbearable. May 26, 1942 was on the surface a quiet afternoon. Heydrich and Lena attended a concert in a Prague hall where compositions by Bruno Heydrich, the father, were performed. The family was reunited. It was a night of music, the same music Reinhard had grown up with. According to some chronicles, at the end of the concert he came to greet the musicians with the natural affinity that any violinist feels before a quality performance. A few streets away, Gabčík and Kubis were making their final checks. For the next day they had prepared 2 briefcases. In one, disassembled into pieces, the Sten-type second machine gun, a low-cost British weapon that was notorious for being light and maneuverable, but also for a weakness that its users knew well. Under certain conditions, the firing mechanism could jam. In the other case, 2 modified hand grenades of special manufacture designed by the SOE. To disguise the contents of the briefcases, they covered them with layers of fresh grass. In times of food shortages, many Prague residents raised domestic rabbits. Carrying grass to feed them was the most normal thing in the world. With that, they went to sleep. The morning of May 27, 1942, dawned with a pleasant temperature for the time of year in Prague, about 17 degrees, partly cloudy skies. Heydrich started the day with his routine, family breakfast, playing with his children. He had been planning to travel to Berlin for 3 weeks to meet Hitler. That day he would do it. From Prague, first by car to the airport, and from there by plane. Around 10:30 a.m., he got into the Mercedes convertible with his driver Johannes Klein. The roof of the vehicle was down. It was sunny enough for that. On the curve of V. Holsovikach Street in the Lieben neighborhood, a dense residential area with trams and pedestrians, Gabčík waited standing on the sidewalk. He carried the briefcase with the Sten. Kubis was a few meters away with the grenades. They had been in their positions for more than an hour, tense, controlling the weather, watching the traffic. With them were 3 other members of the paratrooper network who acted as support and surveillance: Josef Walczyk, Oldrich Paschal, and Adolf Opalka. At 10:32, the Mercedes appeared at the end of the street and began to slow down as it entered the curve. Gabčík threw the briefcase, pulled out the Sten, and pointed it directly at the vehicle. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. The gun jammed. The bullet did not come out. The months of preparation, the training in Scotland, the almost 5-month wait in Prague. All that compressed into that second of mechanical silence. Heydrich, from the convertible back seat, saw Gabčík standing on the sidewalk with a gun pointed at him. He then made the mistake that would kill him. Instead of shouting at the driver to accelerate, he ordered the car to stop, and he stood up, drawing his pistol. That second of arrogance was enough for Kubis. At that moment, Kubis threw one of the grenades towards the Mercedes. It did not enter the vehicle. It missed the shot slightly, and the grenade hit the right rear fender, but the detonation sent fragments of metal and seat padding, horsehair, in multiple directions. Several splinters penetrated the right side of Heydrich's body, in the back, in the hip, in the diaphragm. The spleen was perforated. He was also hit by a fragment of the main that would act in the following days as a vector of infection. Chauffeur Klein jumped out of the car and went in pursuit of Gabčík on foot, leaving Heydrich alone, standing beside the vehicle, gun in hand, but visibly unable to stand upright. Gabčík managed to get the Sten to work at that moment and fired at Klein, wounding him in the leg. Kubis, already on his bike, disappeared into the back streets. Heydrich leaned against the car with increasing difficulty. A passing Czech woman, whose name records list as Marie Navarova, immediately understood what had happened, stopped a delivery truck and helped load Heydrich. He was transported to Bulovka Hospital, a few hundred meters from the site of the attack. The surgeons who received him performed an emergency splenectomy and removed the visible metal fragments. The operation was a technical success. Heydrich regained consciousness, and in the first days it seemed that the prognosis could be favorable. Himmler sent one of the best doctors in the Reich to oversee his recovery. Hitler publicly expressed confidence that he would survive, but the horsehair had penetrated deep, and Prague was not Berlin in terms of medical means available at the time. Throughout the first week of June, signs of sepsis began to appear. On June 4, 1942, at 4:30 a.m., Reinhard Heydrich died of blood poisoning. He was 38 years old. Hitler was furious in a way that his close associates described as different from his usual furies. This was not an outburst of theatrical anger. It was something colder, more like the kind of anger Heydrich himself would have recognized. The retaliation was immediate and disproportionate on a scale that the German military commanders themselves in the Protectorate found excessive. In the days following the May 27th bombing, the Gestapo arrested more than 13,000 people across the Protectorate. Many were tortured, several hundred were executed in Prague alone. But the best-known retaliation, and the most deliberate as a message to the world, was concentrated in a village of 503 inhabitants about 25 kilometers northwest of Prague. Lidice. The regime's intelligence services had falsely linked Lidice to Heydrich's killers from an intercepted letter. The evidence was spurious. None of the paratroopers had any real connection to the village, but that was irrelevant. A tangible goal was needed. Lidice was. In the early morning of June 10, 1942, SS and police units surrounded the village while its inhabitants slept. The men, 173 in all, were taken from their homes and shot right there in the countryside before dawn. The women, 184, were loaded onto trucks and deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Of the 95 children in the village, 81 were taken to the Chelmno death camp in Poland, where they died in gas trucks adapted for murder. The remaining 8 were selected as candidates for Germanization. They were blonde and light-skinned enough to be handed over to German families who would raise them as their own, erasing their identity. After killing and deporting all its inhabitants, German units proceeded to systematically demolish every building in the village: houses, the church, the school. They blew up the cemetery. They removed and altered the course of the small stream that passed through the place, and they filmed the whole process. Not with the intention of hiding it, as they did with most of their crimes, but precisely to show it. The destruction of Lidice was deliberate propaganda. The signal was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who dare to resist. By 1943, where Lidice had been, there was nothing left, just an empty field with overgrown grass. 14 days later, another village met a similar fate. Lezaki in East Bohemia. A radio transmitter belonging to the Silver A Group, one of the other paratroop teams that had landed together with the Anthropoid Group, had been found there. All of Lezaki's adults, 33 people, were executed. Their children were either given to German families or killed. The town was razed, 2 villages wiped off the map, a total of more than 13,000 arrested, several thousand Czechs executed in direct response to the death of a single man. As Prague burned under retaliation, Gabčík, Kubis, and 5 other paratroopers had found refuge in the only place they could, the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius on Reslova Street in the Nové Mesto neighborhood. It was a cathedral of the Czech and Slovak Orthodox Church, and its bishop Gorazd had decided, fully aware of the risk involved, to offer them the shelter of the crypt. The crypt was a narrow, damp space with stone walls more than a meter thick. It had a single opening to the street, a small window flush with the ground level of the sidewalk, through which hardly a person could pass. It was, at the same time, an almost impenetrable hiding place and a death trap if the enemy found it. The 7 men who lived there knew what was happening in the city. They knew Lidice. They knew the posters with the names of those shot. The weight of that guilt, they knew that hundreds of innocent people had died because of what they had done, became unbearable. According to some sources, they discussed among themselves the possibility of going out to a public place, letting themselves be seen, and including in the note that they would leave behind an explicit declaration of authorship that could perhaps stop the reprisals. They did not have time to execute that plan. On June 16, 1942, Karel Kurda, a paratrooper from the Outdistance Group who had fallen in Czechoslovakia on a different mission, presented himself at the Gestapo headquarters in Prague. In exchange for 1 million Reichsmarks and the guarantee of a new identity, he handed over the names of the main members of the network that sheltered the paratroopers, including that of the Moravec family. The Gestapo broke into the Moravec's apartment that same night. Mrs. Marie Moravkova, anticipating what was going to happen, swallowed a cyanide pill and died before they could stop her. Her husband and her 17-year-old son, Arta, were arrested. The young man was subjected to interrogation sessions of a brutality that the regime's own records shamelessly document. Under those conditions, he ended up revealing what his mother had told him in a conversation that he would now remember as the most important of his life. That if they were ever in real danger, they should go to the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius. At dawn on June 18, 1942, SS units surrounded the cathedral on Reslova Street. The number of men deployed to surround the church, where 7 soldiers with guns were hiding, was about 750, according to German records of the operation. The 7 men inside knew, when they heard the first movement in the street, that this was the end. The battle began at 4:15 in the morning. The 3 paratroopers at the top of the cathedral, Jan Kubis, Adolf Opalka, and Josef Bublik, engaged in hours of firefighting from the choir and nave, firing from the windows at a number of attackers that outnumbered them by more than 100 to 1. When the Nazis attempted to enter through the side gates using grenades, the defenders responded from elevated positions with a precision that, according to the report of the German commanding officer sent to Berlin, caused between 15 and 20 casualties among the attackers. Kubis received serious injuries during that first exchange. 2 of the other 3 men on the ship fell in combat. Kubis was taken unconscious from the church by the Nazis when they took the upper floor. He would die shortly afterwards in hospital without regaining consciousness. Opalka and Bublik fell into the church. In the basement, Gabčík and 3 other companions, Valkik, Svak and Hruby, continued to hold out in the crypt for additional hours. The Nazis tried to gain access via the inner staircase and were repulsed. They tried to blow up the door with explosives, and the 4 men resisted. Finally, the German commanders called the Prague Fire Brigade, under duress since many were not volunteers for this task, and ordered pressurized water hoses to be inserted through the small window of the crypt to flood it. The water pressure was growing. The 4 men had to climb over the tombstones and niches to stay above the water level. The Nazis shouted from outside, urging them to surrender, promising their lives in exchange for surrender. None responded to those promises. All four died there. Gabčík shot himself. Records differ as to whether it was with the last bullet left in his pistol or with cyanide, but the conclusion is the same. Walczak, Svak, and Hruby did the same. They ran out of water. They ran out of bullets. They did not give up. The battle for one church, 7 men against 750, lasted more than 6 hours. In the days following the cathedral battle, the regime's retaliation spread even further. Bishop Gorazd and 3 other clergymen of the Orthodox Church who had known about or participated in the shelter of the paratroopers were arrested, tried in a summary trial, and executed on September 3, 1942. Dozens of parishioners and people linked to the church suffered the same fate. Karl Kurda, the traitor, continued to collaborate with the Gestapo until the end of the war. When the Reich collapsed, he tried to hide, but was captured by the Czechoslovak authorities in the months after the liberation. He was tried for treason and executed in Prague on April 29, 1947. According to the records of the trial, when the judge asked him how he could have done it, he replied, "What would you have done for 1,000,000 marks?" Senior Nazi official Karl Hermann Frank, who had signed the destruction orders for Lidice and Lizaki, and who during the occupation was the chief executor of German terror in the Protectorate, was tried by a Czechoslovak court in 1946. He was sentenced to death and publicly executed on May 22, 1946 in Prague, before a crowd of several thousand people. As for Heydrich's funeral, Hitler ordered it to be a state ceremony in Berlin with full honors. On June 9, 1942, the coffin was solemnly transferred from Prague to the Reich. In the palace of the Chancellery, in front of the coffin covered with the SS flag, Hitler pronounced the funeral eulogy. Himmler spoke as well. The Reich hierarchs paraded. It was an impeccably orchestrated show of dueling. And it was also, on some level, that none of those present would have recognized aloud the staging of fear. They all knew who Heydrich had really been, what he had in his files, how much he knew. And everyone, somehow, breathed a little more relieved when the coffin was closed. The widow, Lina von Osten-Heydrich, returned to Prague with her 4 children. Mart had been born shortly after the attack and did not return to Germany until 1945. After the defeat of the Reich, Heydrich's properties were confiscated as the property of war criminals. Over the next few decades, Lina fought in the courts of the Federal Republic of Germany to recover part of those assets, arguing that her husband had been a state official who carried out orders. He won several of those lawsuits. In the 1950s, she obtained a sizable widow's pension from the German courts and regained her family's summer villa. Lina von Osten-Heydrich died in 1985 after decades of publicly defending her husband's memory and denying that she was responsible for any war crimes. His memoirs, published in 1976 under the title Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal, are notable mainly for what they do not say. In 1942, the code name that the Nazis gave to the extermination project within the framework of Operation Reinhard Action Reinhard was a macabre dedication. It would bear the name of Heydrich. Under that name, between 1942 and 1943, the death camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka murdered approximately 1.7 million people, the vast majority of them Polish Jews. The Reinhard Action was named after the man who had planned the system. No one in the regime considered it an excessive honor for someone who had died at the age of 38. On the corner of V. Holosowicach and Kirchmayerova Street in Prague's Liban district, there is today a plaque and a small monument in the exact spot where Heydrich's Mercedes was arrested on May 27, 1942. It is a sober place without architectural drama. The trams keep passing. The neighbors of the neighborhood know him. In the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius on Reslova Street, the basement where Gabčík and his companions fought is now a museum. The walls of the crypt retain the marks of the bullets and the water that tried to drown them. The busts of the 7 paratroopers look out from the niches where their positions were. The place has the particular quality of places where time has not finished passing. Every year, on June 18th, an act of commemoration is held there. In the camp where Lidice was, in northwestern Bohemia, there is also a memorial. There are no ruins. The Germans saw to it that none remained. There is a museum, there is an open field where a bronze sculpture by Maria Uchitilova represents the 82 children murdered in Chelmno. And there's a rose bush, the Garden of Peace, where cities around the world have sent rose bushes as a symbolic gesture since the 1940s. The place is visited every year by tens of thousands of people. In Lazaki, 100 kilometers southeast of Prague, there is another memorial in the field where the village stood. Operation Anthropoid had consequences that the Czech government in exile had not fully anticipated. Beanies had pushed the operation in part to force the Allies to declare the Munich Agreement null and void. He succeeded. The horror of Lidice generated enough international pressure for the United Kingdom and France to formally declare the agreement invalid, thus guaranteeing that the Sudeten territories would be returned to Czechoslovakia once the war was over. That happened, but the price was terrible. More than 5,000 Czechs died directly as a result of the reprisals triggered by Heydrich's death. 2 villages were wiped off the map. Dozens of families who had helped the paratroopers were executed to the last limb, and the 7 men who had carried out the only successful assassination operation of a top Nazi leader in all of World War II all died without exception. Josef Gabčík was 30 years old when he died in the crypt of the cathedral. Jan Kubis, 28. Their home countries, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, have considered them national heroes for decades. In Slovakia, the town of Polovsie, where Gabčík was born, today has streets and monuments in his name. In Moravia, the village of Dolní Vilemovič, where Kubis was born, preserves his memory with equal devotion. There is a question that circulates in the circles of historians who study the Third Reich with a recurrence that never quite ends. What would have happened if Heydrich had not died in June 1942? Would he have succeeded Hitler? Would he have kept the Holocaust going even more efficiently? Would he have been able, with his combination of organizational intelligence and absolute coolness, to prolong German resistance beyond 1945? No one knows. History does not work on conditionals. What we do know is what happened, that the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart died at the age of 38 of an infection, caused in part by the horsehair of a car seat, at the hands of 2 soldiers who had given everything to do something that the free world was incapable of doing from offices and headquarters. The apparatus that Heydrich built continued to function without him. The RSHA continued under Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Operation Reinhard continued its course. The trains continued to roll towards Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. The machinery was already autonomous enough that it did not need its creator, but the creator was Heydrich and the creator was dead. In Prague, when news of his death circulated on the morning of June 4, 1942, the people in the streets did not react. There were no celebrations. It would have been suicidal to do so. But those who were on the trams and in the bakeries and in the markets keep in the testimonies collected after the war that particular moment of silence that is different from fear. The silence of those who understand that something has changed, although they still do not know how or how much. Somewhere in the crypt of the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius, behind a stone wall that still shows the marks of water and bullets, is the exact spot where Gabčík and his men proved that even the most systematized terror has fissures, that even the bureaucracy of extermination has a body, and that this body can be reached by 2 briefcases, a bicycle, a grenade, and 2 men who decided that it was worth trying even if they did not return. The Iron Heart wasn't indestructible after all.